God gives wisdom to the person who asks in faith. Now, we all need wisdom. Whether we're making a really difficult decision or we're just figuring out how we need to respond to a particular thing that's going on in our life or how we need to handle a particular relationship or anything. We all need wisdom all the time. And James gives us a response to this. He says, if any of you lacks wisdom. Now, this word lacks should point us back up to the prior verse in verse 4. Remember that James says right at the beginning of his letter, these trials and difficulties are producing steadfastness, and steadfastness' full effect is that you would be lacking in nothing, right? So that's that same word as lack here. And he's saying, okay, so if you're lacking in something, here's a solution. Ask God. If you need wisdom, ask God. God is the one who has all wisdom. God's wisdom is perfect. He has all knowledge in all of the universe. Ask Him. But why should we ask God? Why should God listen to us? Why would we expect God to respond? Well, he points to God's character. He says God is the one who gives generously to all without reproach. God's generous. God's not sitting up there thinking, oh, they're praying to me again. They want wisdom this time. Why do I have to keep on giving these people wisdom? No, God is generous. He loves to give us wisdom. And then this idea of without reproach, it's like without judgment. God's not saying, oh, really? You need wisdom? Seriously? You don't already know all the stuff that you need to know? No, God's saying, yeah, great. You don't have wisdom? I have wisdom. Let me give you some wisdom. And then there's this incredible guarantee. It says, it will be given to him. Guarantee. If you lack wisdom, you ask God, it will be given to you. But there is one caveat. If we go on to verse 6, it says, let him ask in faith. Faith is key here. Let him ask in faith with no doubting. So the prayer that God promises to generously answer is a prayer of faith. Now, why is it so important that it be a prayer of faith? Why is it important that there's no doubting? Well, we look here, and here's this little word for again. When we see that, it gives us the reason for what it's been talking about before. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Now, I want you all to think back at the last couple of verses. In verse 3 and 4, it talked about trials and testing. And this is showing us one reason why that is so important. In those trials and testings, it produced a thing called steadfastness. And that sounds an awful lot different than what is talking about here. Something that's driven and tossed by the wind, something that's unstable. That's not steadfastness. This is why those sufferings and trials are so important, because they produce steadfastness. How? They produce steadfastness by anchoring us to the truth of who God is. If we haven't been tested and we haven't produced steadfastness, we're not hanging on to the truth of who God is. We're not hanging on to the fact that God is generous and that God gives generously and without reproach. We're not going to come to Him in faith without doubting, because we're not anchored to the truth of who He is. But if we look at God in the midst of our trials and we put our faith in Him, it produces steadfastness in us. It produces this deep faith and understanding that He is using our trials and our suffering, that those things are what He is using to make us something, to produce something in us. And it gives us an immovable, faithful joy that lays the foundation for God to bless us with the wisdom that we ask for and the wisdom that we need. So then, ask Him for wisdom and ask Him in faith. And you can ask Him in faith because we look back at all these trials that we have gone through and we see the goodness of God and we see His generosity and that He gives generously and above reproach. That way, we can approach Him asking for wisdom in faith without doubting. What a privilege we have as the people of God.